The Kyle Rittenhouse trial, Paul Gosar, and COP26. I'm Cecily Fernandez, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Cecily Fernandez. Joining us today are conservative Albert Eisenberg of the publication Broad and Liberty. Albert, nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Progressive Erin Matson, executive director of Repro Action. Erin, welcome.
Thank you.
And independent political advisor Rina Shah. Rina, thanks for joining us.
Hey there. Thanks for having me.
Welcome, everyone. This week, the jury in the Kyle Rittenhouse murder trial went into deliberations. As of this recording, a verdict has not been announced. So with that in mind, Erin, what do you think the jury will decide?
That's great. It's something that everybody is watching in America right now. I mean, what we have seen is a trial where a judge appears to have a pretty clear slant with in favor of Kyle Rittenhouse in particular. I know he's done this with other trials over the past 2 years, but allowing him to actually draw for the jurors, also with not referring to victims of the shooting as victims, but rather having them referred to as rioters and looters. And it's really concerning when the person who's on trial, his mother, is going on Hannity and praising the judge.
Albert, what do you think?
I think it's really ugly. It's really politicized. I think the kid showed very bad judgment. Kyle Rittenhouse. Do I think that he was guilty of going to the scene to try and kill a bunch of innocent people? No. Do I think that they're going to get 12 jurors to convict him of such? No. The media largely has its stance already staked out. I think that's why most people see it and kind of already know what side they're on. And I'm just glad that unfortunate for the victims of the killing. They are victims. They did not go to be murdered that night or to be killed. That doesn't mean you should lock somebody away and throw away the key. And a lot of people who don't really understand the judicial system, not to say that's you, Erin, but a lot of people who don't really understand the judicial system already seem to have their stance on it. That's concerning to me.
And Rita, where do you come down on the jury? Or what do you anticipate the jury will decide?
Well, I think no matter what we know at this point, the jury is going to act in and do whatever it will do, whatever has been said about the judge or the prosecutors. I mean, this trial has been watched broadly and has been opined on by seemingly everybody. So in the court of public opinion, it seems, yes, I do agree with Albert. Many people have just made up their minds. But let's not forget, this is a jury of peers. This is how our system is designed to work. We have to respect that whatever the decision the jury comes to is what should stand. I mean, this is essentially a very sad moment in our country's history because it, to many people, has highlighted almost two systems of justice. But it's also showing us that not everything is as black and white as it's portrayed in the media in the aftermath of an event. There's a lot of gray area there. In seeing Kyle Rittenhouse on the stand, many Americans got to hear firsthand and maybe had a change of heart about his intentions. Though one thing is true here, and we must remember, lives were lost. How or why almost is a little less I shouldn't say important, but almost takes us a backseat to really the fact that life was lost. And that is one thing that I'm always really concerned about, is how we as Americans view the loss of life. And what we say and do in the public square is so important because, again, we can become callous and forget here that this is how justice is delivered, and we ought to respect it no matter what the outcome is.
Okay, well, that's a good segue to our next story, also making headlines this week. The House of Representatives censured a city member for the first time in decades. Here's the story from NBC News.
Resolution censuring Representative Paul Gosar. Tonight, the House voting to censure a member for the first time in more than a decade after a fiery debate.
Do you have no shame?
Rebuking Congressman Paul Gosar and stripping him of his committee assignments. The House punishing the Arizona Republican for tweeting this video earlier this month, showing an animated version of Gosar killing an animated version of New York Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and attacking President Biden.
Rina, we'll go back to you. Do you think in the case of Paul Gosar, the punishment fits the crime, or do you think the Democrats are making much ado about nothing?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I know that incitement comes in various forms, both online and offline. And I think jokes about killing a colleague, I don't even think that. I know that jokes about killing a colleague in the private sector would have resulted in HR and legal departments swooping in right away and talking about termination of employment. So the fact that that was not discussed in Congress is not that unusual because, again, we're talking about a democratically elected member of Congress here that is that people are trying to essentially say he needs to go because he's threatened the life of one of our colleagues. So do the same rules apply that would in a private corporation, for example? I would hope they would, but then that also sets sort of the precedent to say anybody can be removed for behavior that's considered by one party or another, or what certain people to be problematic for the chamber. So I understand removal was never part of the discussion here. Censure, I think, is the least that could be done. Stripping Congressman Gosar is the least that could be done. But it really made me upset more than anything else as somebody who was a senior aide to two different members of Congress, both Republican, both on the House of Representatives side. When I watched Congressman Gosar's floor speech and he, instead of apologizing to Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for what would just be considered, if he and his colleagues seem to think, poor form or a dumb joke, he instead chose to speak about a socialist Marxist bill from the Biden administration, open borders. He never said he was sorry. And I think that is a huge problem. That lack of empathy and the callousness on display by elected leader, that was just so very sad to me, because I know the chamber has many problems. And as we modernize and go into this era where, politics is being done in an unusual manner, things are going to happen like this. But this is dangerous. When elected leaders can make jokes like this about political violence, I really think we've entered a really, really scary time where how do we talk to our children about what's acceptable and what is political violence and what is not? I definitely have a lot more to say on this matter, but I would love to hear from my fellow panelists.
Okay, Erin, you want to pick up on that as well? Do you feel that the cartoon or the anime that Gosar sent out is basically amounts to a death threat?
Absolutely. It's a death threat. There's no such thing as a casual death threat or a joking death threat. In any other scenario, it would be reasonable to expect that there would be restraining orders against him, that he couldn't be in the same physical space as her. It's also an incitement to violence for others. It's a personal death threat, but it's also in this political climate. It's something that encourages other forms of vigilante justice. I think to the points that Rina was making, which I really appreciated, what comes to mind for me in part is we really need to find a way to dial down the violent political rhetoric that's coming out of our directed elected officials. I remember on January 6th, as CNN was playing, my 7-year-old daughter, at the time she was 7, in second grade, hadn't gone to school in ages, saw what was happening on TV, and I burst out into tears. And I pointed to her and I said, this is not what our country is. And this is not what our country is supposed to be. And unfortunately, this utter vile attacks seems to continue. One thing that I do want to point to is this is not a one-off with Representative Gosar or Congressman Gosar. It's also, I'm very much reminded of a graphic that Sarah Palin had congressional districts in the crosshairs, including the congressional district that was held by Gabby Giffords, who was ultimately shot in the head. So this is very serious. It's not just about Paul Gosar. We know that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez already receives a wide number of threats. This is really scary stuff. And the fact that Kevin McCarthy is saying that if Republicans take back control of the House of Representatives, he's going to give Congressman Gosar even better assignments. It tells you everything you need to know that this is a broader problem than just one congressman with sick and violent behavior.
Albert, do you agree with that assessment?
I would say I agree with portions of it. I mean, I think Paul Gosar is an idiot, and it takes a lot to have 6 or 7 of your siblings go on and publicly endorse your Democratic opponent through multiple campaign cycles. So the guy is clearly should not be the face of the GOP, is not helping us build a bigger tent. And the video he released was stupid at the mildest level. And you're right, threatening, not acceptable. The question is there a double standard? So you would forget from, our discussion that the most heinous acts of political violence that we've seen in the last few years have been the attack on Republicans at the congressional baseball field in 2017, where the shooter asked if they were Republicans or Democrats, learned they were Republicans, and opened fire and almost killed Steve Scalise, if not for a brave woman who was protecting them as part of their security detail, and Rand Paul being viciously beaten by a leftist neighbor of his. So this is at a time where Maxine Waters last year, as violence was engulfing a lot of American cities, encouraged people to quote unquote get in their faces and make noise. And that is much more, to me, much more obviously a call to action, a call to disturbance and violence than the crosshairs on Sarah Palin's graphics from a campaign that she, probably paid some consultant to produce. So my question is not, is that inappropriate? It is inappropriate. Paul Gosar is inappropriate. My question is about the double standards that are breeding resentment and anger on the right, which have metastasized and which create a culture where people on the right do not feel that they are given fair treatment. And that's a problem. So that's my bigger concern, I would say, with whether or not he should be censured.
Erin, do you feel that there is a double standard and the Democrats seem to not call out their own?
I don't feel that there's a double standard, but I will say that I appreciate Albert bringing up the shooting at the congressional baseball game. That was horrific, and it is important to note that this is happening. It's an issue. I think it goes back to our first conversation that we were having as well. I think this polarized media environment, and in particular, social media and the way Facebook and other bad actors have engineered it so rage gets the most engagement. I mean, people are getting meaner, truly. They're getting meaner. I know it's an age-old issue that people always refer to the bygone era of politics before, and that's been happening for hundreds of years when allegedly there was more comedy and willingness to get things done. Look, I'm under no illusions that politics isn't a brutal sport, but the fact of the matter is that folks are the level of violent rhetoric and sheer violence is just something we haven't seen before. The fact of the matter is we had people on January 6th in the Capitol calling to hang the vice president.
Rina, do you see any double standard?
Cecily, absolutely. I mean, I made my career on the right, and I know coming up on a liberal college campus how tough it was to identify as a conservative. I've met plenty of people around the country who've had that issue, but I think this is about really just being an American and being able to call out both. When Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was shot, it was just as bad as when Congressman Steve Scalise was shot. Both types of political violence are horrible and equal, and it's sad that that's what our modern era is defined by. I was just as outraged by this beheading cartoon from Congressman Gosar as I was by comedian Kathy Griffin showing President Trump's head beheaded, holding it like that. I thought that was, I know she's a comedian, and I'm not about canceling people. I don't like that. I think comedians, like, for example, Dave Chappelle, like, I think comedians are comedians, but I think when you were talking about a political person, an elected leader, and you're beheading them, whether it's in a cartoon or in just some kind of like stage ploy, that's all bad, because what kind of, again, example does this set for civil discourse of the next generation of people coming up, young Americans, our children? And I think both my fellow panelists can agree with me. Violence against women and against gay individuals, violence against women and gay individuals has been what's the word I'm searching for? I'm missing the word. It has been problematic for years. And so when I see a woman like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I do not have many policy agreements with or differences, I can still feel that is so wrong. And what kind of tone does that set? Because women and gays, we are, these are communities where violence against us, it's only coming to the surface now, how horrible it's been, what women and gay individuals have suffered. And again, we are all equal as Americans. So what are we doing as society condoning certain acts? So we need to be careful about how we apply standards, and we need to really talk about things and call them out for what they are. And remember to take a partisan veneer off of a lot of this. This is just about being simple and decent Americans and really wanting better for our civil discourse. I think when I really look at what is happening on Capitol Hill right now, I see one side wants to suspend us into oblivion, quite literally, and the other side wants to burn it all down, again, quite literally. So I'm thinking, where do American people actually get served and represented here? I think we can only do good for our country by really reclaiming our power and thinking upon the words, we the people. It's up to us to really kind of push for the principles that are enshrined in our Constitution and to unify during these kind of turbulent times where it seems behavior that is absolutely unacceptable is being condoned by those sitting in elected leader positions.
Okay. Moving on to our last story, the latest international climate conference known as COP26 wrapped up late last week. Here's the story from CBS News.
With this conference already well into overtime, it was supposed to end yesterday, delegates today were still trying to thrash out a concluding statement they could all live with.
And we arrive at what I believe is the moment of truth.
But truth had many forms here. For developing countries like India and China, which are still dependent on fossil fuels, there were objections over the one-size-fits-all phase-out of coal use that was being proposed. For delegates from island nations threatened by sea level rise, the amount of money being promised to compensate for the loss and damage that climate change is causing wasn't secure enough. But the Glasgow offer was the best one around.
Albert, I'll start with you. Do you think anything useful came out of COP26?
A lot of methane, most likely. I think I am a conservationist. I'm an environmentalist. I think the Republican Party has been out to lunch on environmental issues, and you don't have to, it doesn't have to be all about climate change. It can be about conservation. It can be about our waterways, the amount of plastics in the ocean, planting trees. There are many, many very interesting, even affordable technologies that can be used. And what seems to be missing is that the right just doesn't want to talk about any of them, like I'll burn my gallon of oil just to own the libs. And then the left, it's constantly these enormous top-down, multinational, totally unrealistic, quote unquote, agreements that we know China and India are not really going to abide by. We know the Gulf states aren't going to abide by them. It's really, to me, a feel-good conference where everyone claps in the end. And who's left out of this? Obviously, most people who want to see some solutions on the environment that are reasonable, that do not, re-retrofit our entire economy, but rather reduce emissions responsibly, clean up our waterways and our ecosystems, and find some common ground to improve our environment as Americans and in the world. And it's just unfortunate because, it's so indicative of this larger cultural debate that seems to get completely lost on both sides of the aisle, and then everyone else is just left empty-handed.
Erin, do you think anything was accomplished at COP26?
Well, I think one of the most important things is that happened at COP26 was actually the pronounced presence of young people moving this forward, which is really at this point the only hope we have. Unfortunately, governments have really dragged their feet on this. The Paris Agreement and the targets that had been set, we can no longer achieve those. They're simply not achievable to hold down temperature increases. And that's something that was agreed to just a handful of years ago. And so unfortunately, I would add to Albert's list, the United States still hasn't gotten itself together on actions that we need to take to reduce global warming. So we need tangible work, much more tangible work, but I am heartened that at least something happened. Oftentimes these things end in even more of a standstill than they do, but most of all, what I'm upset about is that the push to reduce fossil fuel use really tanked during, and no pun intended, during the discussions. And unfortunately, if we really want to move the needle, that is the most important thing to do.
Rina, what do you think? Was it generally a disappointment, COP26?
Somewhere in the middle. The very fact that it happened is something, and all of the sort of attention it received worldwide. There was a lot learned from the youth aspect to sort of what do these discussions even mean? There were a lot of eyes, I think, on countries that have been bad actors. What are they even willing to do and say? So it kind of it did move the needle forward in sort of bringing to the surface some degree of knowledge about who is doing what. But I think that's a long ways away from progress. And so I'm somewhere in the middle on this, funny enough, because I am somebody that is pro-conservation and really believes in actually an all of the above energy approach. I love renewables, I will say, and I come from West Virginia. Actually, I was born and raised in the southern coal field. So I'm somebody that knows that coal really isn't coming back, and we would be better off as a country to start to transition a lot of people like my fellow West Virginians towards more sustainable energy sources and jobs in those fields. However, I think there's been sort of across the board a lack of acknowledgement about an all of the above energy approach and just how important nuclear also is. So one thing I was encouraged by COP26 is that it did drive some conversations forward on bipartisanship here at home, even though this was a global event, and really also talking about nuclear and what can be done without one energy source or the other. So I was encouraged a bit more by that. But and also a second thing I was encouraged by, so I don't think it was all bad, and I don't think it was like a lack of progress there, but I do think it did highlight, secondly, really what Indigenous communities around the world face as well. There were a lot of Native Indigenous climate activists who were kind of speaking their truth more so this year, it felt, than ever before. And so COP26 really highlighted kind of the discrepancies in those activists and how they're perceived by the larger public, whether in their home countries or globally. And so I think highlighting these things is good. It'll drive the discussion forward. But in terms of genuine, real progress, that was lacking.
Let's take some questions from our viewers. Janice Cobb asks, if Rittenhouse is found guilty, what do you think is an appropriate sentence?
Well, if he's killed 2 people and he's found guilty of that, I would think the maximum possible penalty would be appropriate to consider. I think if the judge is in control, I think we would expect that he would give a lenient sentence and that there will probably be a great disappointment with that sentence.
Rina, what do you think? If Kyle Rittenhouse is found guilty, what do you think would be an appropriate sentence?
Again, because lives were lost here, I think whatever is appropriate at the state level, I think it would just the sentencing guidelines that would be appropriate for killing 2 people, even if it was not intentional, even if it was in self-defense. And it seemingly seems more and more that maybe without knowing what a verdict is, that could be it, that kind of thing. But I do think he should face some penalty. He should see jail time. I hope the jury does decide, because this was not right. This was absolutely about lives lost.
And Albert, you want to weigh in on what you would think would be an appropriate sentence if Kyle Rittenhouse is found guilty?
If a jury of his peers decides that he is guilty of a homicide, then you would want to go along with the state guidelines, and justice should be blind. So it would have to be fair, about in line with what people who are not, getting international news coverage receive for such a conviction.
Okay, and moving on to our next question, Caleb Park asks, do these climate conferences produce anything of value? We touched on this a little bit, but if not, he says, why have them at all? Albert, why have these conferences at all if they're not producing anything?
I've probably become too cynical about these types of things. I mean, I think they're self-affirming. I think John Kerry lives to take his private jet to such conferences, and that is just how how our leaders work in America and around the, they go to the junket, they toast themselves, everyone claps, everyone spends enormous amounts of money. At this point, there's viral, videos of everyone's private motorcades flying away and spewing emissions, and then we just move on to the next conference. So that's my stance, but it's probably a little cynical.
Rina, what do you think? Do you think that it's worth having these conferences if they don't produce much?
I actually do not believe it should have happened. I mean, I think it was a poor attempt at really trying to show some form of leadership when Albert made the perfect example of, you're going to take private jets to this thing. Are we not even considering what we're talking about here? It was very rich in that way, and no pun intended there, but I guess it's a double meaning. but really, if you look at what actually was achieved there was very little. And I think this could have been a series of roundtables without all the fanfare of Glasgow. And truly, I think I hope this gets people thinking about how we convene in future years, because this was just a very much a dog and pony show, in my opinion.
Erin, we'll give you the last word on whether these conferences are worth having at all if they don't seem to produce much.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of bluster, and in this case, hot air, literal hot air going through, and much deflated accomplishments is just the way politics works, including international politics. And so I don't think it was nothing. I think it's actually, there's no way, even if we'd had it, it seems like the appropriate thing to do would have been to hold it on Zoom, right? Like that would have been a much better environmental impact. It would have hewed to the intent of the conference. But without it, I don't think we would have had these headlines and the depth of coverage and sustained attention to the issues. So I do think it's important. It's frustrating, but we have to keep coming together in order to keep moving the ball forward and doing the work. So I look forward to the next international gathering on this. It's just something that we have to do.
Okay. Could we find bipartisan agreement and just say, let's stop sending John Kerry?
John Kerry has to sit one out. Maybe he can only appear on Zoom.
If he wears his mask on the plane, I'm fine with it.
Is it if he takes a public plane? Does that, if he flies with others?
Yes. I think that would help the optics immensely.
So is it a zero net emissions issue that you just like him to, not take up a different plane? Yeah.
Well, we are just about out of time, but we do have time for the most underreported story of the week. Rina, would you like to go first?
Sure. It was an execution that was supposed to happen today at 4 p.m. in the state of Oklahoma. And I'm so glad it didn't happen, because the leadership of Republican Governor Kevin Stitt, he did recognize that an eye for an eye would leave the world blind. And I think it was really important that he granted Julius Jones clemency today. And it was just hours away from being executed by the state of Oklahoma. The Oklahoma Parole Board had recommended that Julius, of course, not face death, but also be given a chance to have parole. Unfortunately, Governor Stitt did not go that far. He stopped him from being executed, but he has at this point decided that Julius Jones will remain in prison without a chance for parole. People have said that he is innocent. His family has said that he's innocent. The victim's family, unfortunately, has said there's overwhelming evidence to show that Julius Jones is guilty, and they're just happy that he will remain in jail.
Erin, what about you? What's your most underreported story of the week?
Yeah, so I would choose the fact that drug overdoses deaths are at a record high, and we've had very little discussion about it. There continues to be an epidemic of drug-related deaths, and it should be the case. We need to make systematic changes so that naloxone is available everywhere, that this is easily obtainable, so that people have training, even when they're coming up in schools, to know how to recognize what an overdose looks like and to help support their fellow people, so that we don't have these unnecessary, needless, and tragic deaths.
Albert, you get the last word. What's your most underreported story of the week?
So listeners will probably be tuning into the decennial redistricting process, which is the process by which each individual state allocates its congressional delegation and draws the maps. One map that's quite interesting to me as a campaign consultant is the map that Governor Steve Sisolak just signed in Nevada. Democratic legislature spread very thin. It's 3 Democratic districts to hopes of creating a 3 Democratic to 1 Republican map. But with Hispanic voters rapidly trending towards the GOP, I don't think it's going to cut it, and it might end up being the biggest dummy mander of the decade. So I'm very interested in those Nevada maps and how they shake out.
Okay, well, all interesting stories to be following. That's all the time we have for this week's The Square Circle. I'm Cecily Fernandez. Thanks so much to all of our guests, and thanks to all of you for watching. We'll see you next time.